on to another poetry. For example, in another one it says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." So, what does he mean by that? Spontaneous. So, he looks at the rainbow, and it was an immediate and instantaneous reaction to the beauty itself. So, here in this poem, Daffodils, he says, "10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance." Beautiful, a spontaneous expression. But in the last part of the poem, right, that he says, while he was lying on his couch in vacant pensive mood, it flashes upon that inward eye. Then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So he was pensive, he was at home in his own room, in the privacy of his room. Whatever mental picture he made of the daffodils, it comes back to his mind's eye. Then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Now, look at his critical position. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. In the silence of your home, you recollect all those emotions. Look at that practitioner, a writer, a poet who talks about his creative endeavor as well as a critical viewpoint. Now, similarly, in his biography of literature, H.T. Coleridge, he talks about fancy, imagination. For instance, he says fancy is something that is emancipated from time and space. So, what does he mean by that? For fancy, no, it doesn't have any particular time or any particular space. Right? You don't think about this day or this moment or this era or fancy. Whereas imagination is slightly different. Of course, he makes this subtle distinction between fancy and imagination. But when he brings in, right? Fancy. Now look at this. I put this poem, Kubla Khan, that he talks about how he built in Xanadu with Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome between where Alps the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. Initially, he talks about China, where Kubla Khan ruled from. Then, in the middle of the text, right, a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Abyssinia, we know it is the old name of modern day Ethiopia. Now, in your fancy, in your mind, it moves, it travels from China to Africa. So, from China to Abyssinia or Ethiopia, all are melded and they are merged in the same form, right? Maybe he had taken opium and his opium laden mind was able to conjure up such a vision, but it doesn't deviate from his stated position of fancy and imagination. Okay, so the writers themselves acted as critics. Matthew Arnold, for instance, a wonderful critic. I'm not going into Matthew Arnold in detail, but Matthew Arnold, in his study of poetry, that he rates the poets, right? Who is good. For instance, he has a very good verse from Thomas Gray, who wrote Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. He calls him a classicist, a minor classicist, because he follows strictly the rules. He plays by the rules when it comes to composing his poem. So, when he wrote his Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, it's such a short elegy, but he follows that iambic pentameter religiously from line 1 to the last line. So he has a lot of appreciation for him. When he looks at himself as a poet, Matthew Arnold says, maybe he is not a great poet like many of them. That was his own self-evaluation as a critic. So now, criticism. Now look at the different stages of criticism. He also talks about moral philistinism, right? Where because of the presence of, uh, because of the industrial age and how wealth has started replacing human values and how a human is being is rated or valued because of his possessions. As a result, our value system had started changing, at least at that time, even now. So he talks about the new are rich, the newly rich, and others who lack that critical sensibility, the ability to appreciate. He calls them simply uh, Philistines, right? People who are incapable of appreciating poetry or any work of art for them. Okay, right? This was 19th century for us. Now, 20th century, of course, you have given me the assignment of talking about things that happened after World War II. But what happened before that? Look at the period between 1901, when Victorian era ended, and 1945. Look at this 45 years, or roughly 44 years. What happened during this period? If you could understand, then I would go into detail about what happened next. So criticism flourished, right? The new critics were there in the US. They continued to write even after uh, the World War II, after the end of the World War. But they were very popular in the 1920s. Then there were the images movement, for example, Ezra Pound and others. So now Ezra Pound even we talked about how a poem might be with the ABC of poetry. A beautiful poem, right? So that is wherein it is said your work has a poem should have or a work has concentrate on words, logopedia, right? Then it should have music, melopia, and it should have what we call phanopia, that is a rich imagination. Logopia, melopia, and phanopia. Right. These are all prescriptions, but the images follow these prescriptions meticulously as they produce poetry. Right. And writers were also talking about their own writings, including Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Do they have a model for them? Yes. In the previous century, right, when Edgar Allan Poe wrote that famous poem, The Raven, a wonderful literary ballad, he writes about how he composed that poem. Raven. So, and the whole art of composition, how he left certain words, how he incorporated certain words, and how that particular words and that particular sentence gives meaning, how it generates meaning, and how it adds vigor to the language. So they had other models before that. So T.S. Eliot commented about writing, especially in tradition and individual talent. He also wrote about the metaphysical poets. So he commented on uh, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Okay, so now people were offering a kind of literary criticism. Now listen carefully. The new critics. Then came a crop of what we call critics who based the criticism on language. They had a reason to do so because around that time, Edmund Husserl made phenomenology a popular subject. Edmund Husserl. What is phenomenology? The phenomenon of language, right? We humans, we are known to exist in this world and for the creation of this great culture and civilization for ourselves with the aid of, now, it is a phenomenon, a strange thing in our head, the way uh, we are neurologically wired, our brain is wired, what we call mind, what we call soul, right? What we call thinking, what we call reflective thinking, what we call even problems related with this mind, our forgetfulness, right? And our, uh, for instance, some people suffer from aphasia. There are many things. So language itself is a phenomenon, and it controls our mind, it controls our body. Another person who came on the scene was Freud. He was talking about the unconscious, what originally started as an unconscious psychology. He started that. Then he started talking about the mental makeup of a human being. Now look at the contribution of phenomenology, psychology, and linguistics. So many people say literary criticism took a linguistic turn at this point. So now linguistics spoken by Sachot. Now Sachot from Ferdinand de Saussure from France. So, Edmund Husserl, Freud, Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, who were the people influenced by that? The American new critics, right? So, especially Cam Brooks, who we are very familiar with, in his paradox in language, but paradox in poetry, it talks the language of paradox. It's a hard language, he says. And he warns us, don't be misled by the language that is used by Wordsworth. It is not that simple because Wordsworth claims that he was using a language of the ordinary man. But here Clare Group warns us. All right. Then look at the structuralists, the phenomenologists, and the psychologists. Their influences could be seen in the writings that happened. Then outside this three, there was this modernist era that was emerging. Modernism as we call it. Now, modernism that was fueled by the arrival of technology, large scale use of technology, and also the experimentation around this time. Technology itself was one kind of experimentation with the machines and with all those artifacts, right? So it was a kind of experimentation. People were trying to fly. Of course, they invented an aircraft. Then they were trying to use something like a submarine, something that could be submerged in the water and it could sail under the water. A machine gun for that matter. Then the arrival of the passenger car. Likewise, in literature, there was a large-scale experimentation. There came so many art. I'm not going into those, which we simply call the modernist era. So, phenomenology, psychology, structuralism, or structuralist, are linguistics, then what we call machines. All right. And they shape the criticism. For example, T.S. Eliot was a great experimenter, and Virginia Woolf was a great experimenter. And the other person, right? Who was the other person? From Ireland, he went and settled down. The portrait of an artist as a young man, and Ulysses. With all that, James Joyce, he experimented with language. Right. Now, when Samuel Beckett wrote, of course, he wrote much later, Waiting for Godot, he wrote it originally in French. He was experimenting with the drama form. People were experimenting. Look at Wasteland. When you take a first look, it doesn't appear like a piece of code. It looks like an odd assortment or collection of words and sentences and phrases, borrowed not only from English, but from different languages. Right? It appears to be a hodgepodge of um, images. Right? So now it doesn't appear like a piece of poetry at all. So large scale experimentation. So the linguists, the phenomenologists, the psychologists, the researchers, uh, they were analyzing this kind of so now far away in Russia, there was a group of the Russian farmers. I'm not going into them. They were looking at the form, that is the structure, the construction, how something is constructed, how the language is constructed. So later, Lacanian psychology, and he says the unconscious itself is structured like a language. Of course, he is of the view that language has nothing but paradigms, sentence paradigms and structures. Now, anything that violates such paradigms and structure, it collapses the language and destroys the. Okay. Now, this position is different from a Freudian position of the human mind as something like polymorphous perverse. It's polymorphous. It is not structured as a but the discussion is towards whether everything is layered in the human head or it is polymorphous, unlayered. But it's still into literary criticism. So the Russian founders, they talk about form and meaning. Okay, now I come to the point. Next 45 minutes I spend on you need to have an understanding. So now next 45 minutes we'll spend on post-war, post-World War happenings because it is going to be post-structuralism. Structuralism, post-structuralism. Almost around 1945, 1950, colonialism ended in most parts of the world. A new world emerged, what we call a post-colonial world. Now, what was the colonial legacy in this country? Again, language, the English language. So, post-colonialism emerged as another major literary theory. Post-structuralism, because structuralist linguistics focused on the linguistic structure, a sentence structure, a poetic structure, and so on. A poem itself has a structure. For instance, a sonnet has a structure, a ballad has a structure, a play has a structure, three-act plays, one-act play, five-act play. They have a structure. So now, structuralism focused on what the language. Now, at the same time, the linguists of that time who were emerging, for example, you have higher Richards and his student William Nelson. Higher Richards, he makes it very clear, whatever you write, he makes this huge difference between emotive and referential language. The language that is used by artists, that is poets, dramatists, they are capable of tingling human emotions. They are capable of communicating emotions, which is different from a referential language. That is the language of science. The language of science, for example, when you say the earth um, rotates on its own axis and revolves around the sun, this is Kepler's law of planetary motion. The earth rotates on its own axis and revolves around the sun. No emotions, nothing. Matter of fact, stating a scientific fact or a scientific principle. So you need to distinguish this kind of language. That is his position. And he also says, whatever you write, it should have sense and it should have attention and so on.